All right. Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 590. We're doing something a little bit different today. Those of you who are longtime listeners of the podcast have heard me do my best to talk about poetry a few times before on the podcast, but I've said that I don't have much background on it. I didn't get, unfortunately, the best poetic education coming up in high school or college English. But fortunately, today I'm lucky enough to be joined by someone who has that background, and he's here to talk a little bit about his work, Dr. Mike Freiling. Mike, welcome to the History of Japan podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to do a little interview today to talk about Mike's new publication entitled 100 Poems from Old Japan, a translation of a text we've talked a little bit about before on the podcast, the Hyakunin Isshu. But before we get into the text itself, Mike, I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself, share a bit about your work, and especially how you got interested in Japanese language and especially poetry, and why you kind of gravitated towards waka and tanka as opposed to, say, haiku as a more famous genre, I think, for most people coming into Japanese poetry. So please tell us a bit about how you got here.
Yeah, that's a great question, Isaac. Let me just give you a quick background. I was born and raised in San Francisco, and I'll talk about the influence of San Francisco in a few minutes. I went to college at the University of San Francisco. Then I went to grad school at MIT. I did a PhD at MIT, and one of the earliest PhDs in artificial intelligence, believe it or not. I finished that in 1977. And then spent my first year in Japan as a Henry Luce scholar. And that's when I actually got started with the Hyakunin Isshu. And then went on to do a variety of sort of data science and AI related jobs for most of my career until about 2 or 3 years ago, when I kind of retired from that work, decided to get back into poetry and back into translations. And now we're on the second book of our translations. It's sort of a chronological bookend. In this book we have the early classical Japanese poetry. The first book we did was actually almost contemporary. It was wartime senryu poems composed by Japanese Americans right across the river in Portland, Oregon, as they were being incarcerated during the Second World War. And so it's kind of an interesting combination. And I'm spending some time doing some research now, looking for connections between the two that I'll be talking about next month at the Vancouver Public Library. So that's going to be kind of fun. Now, getting back to the question of how did I get into poetry, I guess I would say San Francisco is a kind of a poetry town. And San Francisco, when I was growing up, I started high school in 1964, finished in 68, went to the University of San Francisco right up on the hill in the middle of San Francisco, if you guys know San Francisco. I finished that in 1972. So during my high school and college years, I was a 7-minute walk away from the Haight-Ashbury. And what that means for me is that I was able to go listen to people like Allen Ginsberg or Gary Snyder or Lenore Kandel, who's not known so much anymore, but to my mind, she's sort of like the hippie equivalent of Sei Shonagon. We'll get to that, I guess. I was there at the Human Being in 1967. I snapped pictures of Ginsberg and Kandel. That was considered to be sort of the high point. So I sort of saw the rise and then what happened afterwards in the hippie movement. But all along, I sort of gravitated towards poetry. And what I particularly love about poetry is the importance of making every word count. So when I was in college, I hooked up with a couple of Japanese, they were Hawaiian kids from Japanese ancestry, and we sort of got involved in all the bad boy things that you can do with Japanese culture. Read Yukio Mishima, watch Kurosawa movies till the swords are just flashing before your eyes and stuff like that. And then I took that interest with me into MIT, where despite the fact that I raised a few eyebrows by doing this, I took some courses from David Ferry, who's a well-known poet, over at Wellesley College. And with a couple of buddies, we actually started a literary magazine called Rune. And we intended that to be just a one issue. Well, let's just do it for the fun of it because MIT's got this real do-it-yourself kind of philosophy. But a couple of years, actually just recently, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, I was at a alumni party and I was talking about it with somebody. Said, yeah, we did this one issue literary magazine called Rune. He said, oh no, that wasn't an issue. It's the official magazine. So I
Yeah,
had no
clearly you
idea.
started something there.
We started something and somebody else picked it up without us knowing it. And in that inaugural issue, I contributed 3 poems and 2 were Japanese poetic forms. One was a haiku and the other one was a collection of 4 renga, linked verse forms, where each verse kind of keys off of an image from the previous verse. So it was only 4, usually those things stretch to be 100 or so, but it was kind of like one of the things I was quite interested in those days. And so generally speaking, what I was planning to do, and I managed to pull it off, was to spend a year in Japan once I finished my PhD and have some fun learning Japanese and learning how to read Japanese poetry in Japanese and learning how to translate it. And so that's when I started on this Hyakunin Isshu project, because I needed a project to kind of focus my mind. I was taking classes, but I needed to focus on something that was achievable. And since the Hyakunin Isshu had only about 100 poems in it, I chose that. Now, your question is really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think is a great kind of just thing to note in terms of thinking about like the kind of wider history of Japanese poetry. If you're a longtime listener of the podcast, you've heard me talk about things like Manyoshu or the Kokinshu that are kind of, very classical, Manyoshu in particular, but that are, these massive sprawling, I think Manyoshu has north of 700 poems in it, if I remember right.
Yeah, I actually did some research. Yeah, 4,500.
Oh yeah. Okay. I'm way off. Maybe it's Kokinshu that has 700.
Yeah.
But Hyakunin Isshu by comparison is this much more kind of manageable, approachable, and I guess we'll talk about how it came together, but in the eyes of the person compiling it, very much the best of the best in
Right.
terms of kind of the distillation of this classical poetry. So it makes sense as a kind of an entry into that world.
Yes. Yeah. So let me talk about for just a second why I gravitated towards classical Japanese tanka or waka poetry instead of haiku, which is so much better known. In my mind, when you write a haiku, it's a lot like taking a snapshot with a camera. You've got enough space to get one scene on there, and there may be a story within the scene, but the story tends to be implicit. There's not in any room to set up a dynamic or a contrast unless you're very, very skillful. Whereas with tanka or waka, I use those terms synonymously. Waka is actually a broader term for all Japanese poetry, but it tends to be applied to tanka. You have an extra 2 lines. It's 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. And with those extra 2 lines, you can set up a kind of a tension between the first 3 lines and the second 2 lines. And most of the poems tend to have that structure. It's more dynamic. And the topic matter is more human. With haiku, you have Basho's famous frog jumping into his famous pond. And that's kind of like a very, very much of a nature scene, and you get what you can out of it. But with tanka, what you have, and especially in the Heian period poetry, you have one person addressing another person in many cases. So these poems are written from one specific person to another, usually either from a man to a woman or a woman to a man, because it was a very romantic period. There was a lot of romantic jumping around. And part of the rules of the game in those days were if you entertained a lady for the evening, which she entertained you because it would always happen at her house, then when you left in the morning, you were expected to send her a poem. And this was the ironclad rule of decorum in the Heian period. You had to send her a poem, and it had to be witty, and it had to protest your undying love in the most eloquent terms possible. And so you get a lot of these poems that are very effusive in describing how I can't live without you. how just one night with you has changed my whole life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll see some of those examples when we later on. Um, but that to me is just, the Japanese have this expression, kini iru.
It speaks to you, or it kind of clicks with you in a
Speaks
way.
to my heart, speaks to my soul in a way that, haiku for me, and nothing wrong with haiku. I write haiku myself too, but it's a different character.
It is. I think I like what you note about the snapshot dynamic of haiku. It is worth noting that when you think of the most famous examples of haiku, something like Oku no Hosomichi, The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Basho, you have these poems, but to kind of set up the scene, there's often a couple of paragraphs of prose that go with each one that kind of, you don't necessarily need them to be able to appreciate the artistry, but they are helpful for understanding the context in a way that there are commentaries on Hyakunin Isshu that do similar things, but you don't necessarily need those as much to get a sense of the scene. It's still, I think, if you look at some of these poems, and we will talk about a few of them in a bit, you can still get a pretty good sense of the dynamic without that sort of extra layer. I think that's a really good comparison to make in terms of just maybe a bit of a data science way of thinking about it. The extra data that's included in two more lines gives you a little bit of a richer image, so to speak.
That's right. You could turn the data into a story much more easily. And the poems tend to stand on their own. The meaning of some of these the meaning of these poems is immediately clear in most cases. You don't need to grab a dictionary or, think deeply about nature in order to capture them.
Absolutely. Now, as for Hyakunin Isshu itself, because of course, tanka is a very wide-ranging genre, it has a long history.
Sure.
It's hard to kind of talk about that text without talking about the guy who created it. Longtime listeners of the podcast, again, will remember our friend Fujiwara no Teika, who is one of the sort of great figures in Japanese poetry, in the sort of taste making of Japanese literature. So just to give us all a quick refresh, who is Fujiwara no Teika? How does he sort of matter in the history of Japanese poetry, and especially in the creation of this text, Hyakunin Isshu?
Yes, that's a really good question. Fujiwara no Teika was one of the people who was born in the Heian period and lived into the Kamakura period. So he saw the Heian period officially ended, I think it was 1185 with the Battle of Dan-no-ura. Teika was already alive then, but he survived far enough into the Kamakura period to see the end of the Minamoto clan and the takeover by the Hojo Regency. And that, I think, crystallized in his mind. It was definitely a kind of that, what do you say, the end of the era feeling. And I think that may have been some of his thinking in producing the Hyakunin Isshu. Was sort of like, this is the summation of 600 years of Japanese poetry. If you, like I said, the Manyoshu covers a period of about 75 to 100 years of poetry. The Kokinshu, maybe it's 150. The Shinkokinshu is 400 or so, but it picks up right after the Kokinshu. So these imperial anthologies are much more extensive in their collection of poetry, but more limited in the time frame of interest. Whereas the Hyakunin Isshu starts in the 600s and ends in the 1200s with Fujiwara no Teika, who was, as tastemaker is an excellent word to use. He made the taste, and he was clever enough to make sure that his taste was the taste. So he's got a poem in the Hyakunin Isshu. He has 40 some odd poems in the Shinkokinshu because he was appointed by Emperor Go-Toba to be the compiler of that anthology. So he made sure he was well represented. One of the things I like very much about Teika is, he has this kind of reputation as a brash. He had many, many squabbles with Emperor Go-Toba, but he had a very deep and human side too. And one of the tragic figures at the end of that era was Minamoto no Sanetomo, who was the last of the Minamoto clan, and he was assassinated by the Hojo. And he kind of had these premonitions of his fate, but he assembled around him in a kind of a very interesting way. Fujiwara no Teika became his tutor in poetry, and you may have heard of the monk Eisai, who was the monk founder of the Rinzai Zen school, and also the man who introduced tea into Japan. Actually became a kind of a spiritual counselor to Sanetomo as this is going on. So I have high regard for Teika in that respect. He wasn't just some sort of a, clever Machiavellian career manager.
It is, I mean, this is maybe a bit of an internal bias because, again, if you are a longtime listener of the podcast, you probably know my two favorite Japanese poets are Ikkyu and Issa, both of whom are partially known for being a little bit more, let's call it, say, déclassé in their humor, a little bit more joking in a way that was intentionally scandalous, but both of whom really lived these very kind of rich lives that I think you see reflected in the poetry. They kind of did not try and hold themselves apart as these like artists maintaining a distance from the world. And I think that's very reflected in the feeling of familiarity you get when you read their work. And I think it's great to note that Teika has this very similar approach where he's not just a man who is observing this period of growing political instability where you're seeing this long-standing rule by the emperor and the clans around him starting to be challenged by the warrior class. He's in it. He's a part of it. He knows, Emperor Gotoba, who is the last emperor to really try and militarily challenge this system until the Meiji, well, really the people who are controlling Meiji, 600 years later. He works with the Minamoto. He's familiar with the Hojo, these warrior families that are coming to dominate politics. And I do, maybe this is my own prejudices based on what I like in a poet, but I do think it is reflected in the style of his poetry that he is more kind of politically engaged, politically involved. You see this kind of depth of feeling, I suppose, that comes from I'm having, in my understanding, lived a very rich life, a very interesting life.
Yes, I would agree. And also, the generosity there because he had many squabbles with Gotoba. And I think at one point he was booted out of the court. He sort of, I think, came back after Gotoba was exiled, if I remember correctly. And yet he was generous enough to include Gotoba's poem, which is one of the ones we may read to you in his compilation. So I think you're right. I mean, somebody who's lived a rich life and has that practical experience can bring that to bear in the poetry in interesting and subtle and not so subtle ways.
So one thing I want to kind of also talk a little bit about here is the challenge of Japanese poetry as a medium. If again, listeners can kind of stretch back to a while ago, almost 140 episodes ago, we talked about Fujiwara no Teika, who is the great tastemaker of the end of classical Japan, the late Heian period, the 1100s and 1200s, building on the work of Kino Tsurayuki, who's kind of on the other side. He's in the early Heian tastemaker. And Kino Tsurayuki pioneers this style that Fujiwara no Teika then builds on, where poetry can become very kind of referential. There's a lot of deliberate attempts to call back to imagery or specific lines from previous poems from these great imperial anthologies, because you're assuming that this is like a social world where the person you are writing to, your lover who you're leaving a poem behind for, has also read those poems, and they will get the reference and kind of show off your own erudite education and high knowledge of these great arts. And as a result, when I think of like the academic versions of Hyakunin Isshu that I've read before, they tend to be footnoted to death to say, oh, this line is a callback to this, and this character is a pun on this character that is reminder of this text from however long ago. And it can just make for a very disjointed reading experience in this very unpleasant way. You don't do that. You,
No, I don't.
having read your version of Hyakunin Isshu, it's much more approachable. It's much more letting the work stand on its own. So, how do you kind of strike this challenging balance between the sort of referentiality of the text and helping people understand that versus wanting something that is more approachable, that someone's going to pick up in a bookstore and not immediately say, "Oh, I don't have a PhD in Japanese literature. This is not for me."
Right. Well, um, you've heard that expression, necessity is the mother of invention. And
Absolutely.
for me, the necessity here is the fact that my PhD is in something other than classical Japanese studies. So I simply do not have the background of some of these other great translators. Um, with that, I'll give you another cliche. We stand on the shoulders of giants. I read 4 or 5 of the English translations very thoroughly before I finished this final version. Interestingly enough, in 1978, they weren't there. There was only one translation in English of the Hyakunin Isshu I could get my hands on. And most of the work I was doing was reading contemporary Japanese translations of the Hyakunin Isshu. But it's also a matter of temperament. The way I think about it is there's a whole spectrum between the academically pure translation that can be used in a critical edition and the more free-flowing kind of poetry that you can actually read and listen to and appreciate, which is to me what the ground of poetry is it's meant to be read. It's, as poems in Japanese are also often referred to as uta, which means song. So there was a initial genesis of the waka form in song that eventually just became pure poetry. But still, it's meant to be listened to, it's meant to be appreciated. And so where I fit on that spectrum, I would say is about somewhere between 75 and 80% of the way towards the free form. My poetry, the translations are not free form. I spend a lot of time reading the background, but I don't read the background to catch all the nits. I look for what I call the dramatic structure of the poem. What is the poet trying to convey? So to give you an example, if you read one of these so-called morning after poems, the poet is tasked with conveying his deep appreciation for last night's entertainment expressed as undying love, as insatiable desire, etc. And you would accent that part of the poem as you craft the words that form the poem. On the other hand, if you're reading with the poems by the Buddhist monks, and believe it or not, out of these 100 poets, 12 of them are Buddhist monks, more than 10%, which kind of surprised me when I, data scientist, I did the numbers. But when you're reading a poem by one of those people, their focus is the typically Buddhist concerns of the evanescence of life, the pathos of life, the eternal tension between detachment and desire. And so you grasp that as the dramatic structure, and you try to craft the poem along those lines, setting up the dynamic between the detachment and the desire, so to speak. So understanding this context is something that you use to frame the poem rather than try to squeeze it into every single word. Now, as for the classical allusions, most of the time you just sort of have to, poetry is a matter of prioritizing, and most of the time, if you want to write something that's readable, you have to let that drop by the wayside. There's a few of these poems where it becomes important, and usually that deserves a footnote. But we encountered the same thing with our They Never Asked, which is our translation of Wartime Henry poems. There are allusions there. In fact, there's one poem where there's an allusion to the Heian period, and I found that kind of cute. So you have to kind of, if you can do that, you work it in. We did in that case, but you do what you can. It's basically, but you don't let. I don't know if you've ever heard this. There's a a literary magazine in Australia that has the title "Kill Your Darlings," and I thought, wow, what a name! Where did this come from? And it comes from an expression that's been attributed to several writers, Faulkner being one of them, but there are others too, which is, if you want to write well, you have to kill all your darlings. Your darlings being the little clever turns of phrase or allusions that you're so proud of that may be very clever in their own right, but detract from the overall structure of the poem. And I think that's the philosophy you have to use if you want to write poetry that can be read and appreciated. You have to kill that instinct to be too clever, too academic, and stick to the expressions the way ordinary people think about it.
This is reminding me of the number of times where I've been writing a podcast episode on something and thought, oh, this is a fun little tangent I can go down. And before long, I've eaten up like 20-25% of my word count for a given episode and having to reorganize my plans for everything. Yeah, maybe I need to get a little better at killing my own darlings when it comes to the hard work of hitting that balance.
It's an eternal struggle, let me tell you.
Absolutely. I mean, it is one of the things I was thinking about reading this is that Hyakunin Isshu has this kind of reputation for being so current, I suppose. It's still very much a part of the school curriculum in Japan. Whenever I have international students from Japan, usually they can pull a couple of poems from memory from Hyakunin Isshu in the same way that students I've had from China can still recite some Li Bai or some Du Fu from memory, because it's just a part of like the elementary and middle school curriculum in this foundational way. And one of the things I really like about this translation is you get that sense of currency because there's not this kind of academic need to catch all the references, to hit all the allusions along the way. The words just kind of stand on their own a little bit more, and the feeling stands a little bit more on its own. And the feelings, I mean, I think that's the genius of Fujiwara no Teika. He's very good at picking a poem that evokes an emotion, and those emotions are very timeless. They don't feel like they come from 1,000 years ago, or about, I guess, technically, 800-ish years ago. Not a math teacher. That's more your field. But that's I think allowing those to stand a little bit more on their own makes this a great entry into poetry as a subject. One more thing I want to ask you about before we get to talking about some of the actual poems, and that is the challenge of classical Japanese itself as a language. Not the same as modern Japanese. Again, a longtime listeners will know that I've tried my hand at about a semester of classical Japanese with the great Paul Atkins at the University of Washington, who actually literally did write the book, the main biography of Fujiwara no Teika, that is out there today. It's a wonderful book. He's a wonderful teacher. That class still almost killed me. Even with a pretty good background in Japanese, I struggled with it. It is a much more contextual, even language than modern Japanese in a lot of ways, based on how the grammar works. It is fundamentally structured somewhat differently. It's even written, the orthography is different in classical Japanese, the way words are sort of written out. So that creates this interesting balance where you then have to be thinking about fidelity in translation, trying to capture the kind of balance and accuracy of the meaning of the original versus feeling, right? Focusing
Right.
more on the emotion and how, what is Teika trying to convey with this poem and how, or picking this poem, and how do I get that across? How do you approach that? If you're coming up on a new poem and you're thinking about where do I put the balance between accurately representing the Japanese sort of word for word versus accurately representing the feeling? How do you approach that
Right.
choice?
Well, let me start by telling you a little story. If classical Japanese was difficult for you, it was certainly difficult for me, and it's difficult even for most Japanese students. When we got our first author's copies of this book when I was still in Japan back in early June, and we presented one to one of my wife's relatives, and she's very literate in both English and Japanese. She used to translate for one of the hotels in Kyoto, and she starts looking at it and she looks up. She goes, I could never understand the Hyakunin Isshu, but with your English translation, I can understand what's going on. And so that's kind of cute, but it just points up this is a very difficult subject about how do you navigate that classical Japanese, which is so difficult. I'll say, paradoxically, you tend to have one thing going in your favor. which is Japanese poetry tends towards the ambiguous.
Mm.
And with that, you can exploit that ambiguity to, I would say, maybe elide over some of the formal nuances of the grammar. And, sentences are often left half finished, and you can sort of use your imagination. And again, what I talked about earlier, that sense of the dramatic structure that you really want to get across to craft the nuances into something that makes sense. So that's one thing you do. Another thing you do, of course, is you read the experts and study what they've done and how they've interpreted the poem. And you can decide, in many cases, I decide to follow what other people have done. In many cases, I decided, no, I'm going to go in a different direction, because in many cases, there's like 3 or 4 stories about how this poem came to be. And I would tend to choose one because the romance of these poems is so important to me. I would tend to choose one that would veer in that direction of the romance, because, I think if you looked at anybody's playlist on Spotify, you'd see that 90% of the songs they listen to are love songs of one form or another. It's the universal human obsession. And so when you take that and you take some knowledge of that subject and then you exploit the ambiguity, you can find a way to kind of like, it's almost like Play-Doh or something like that. You kind of mold it into the thing that you want, even though the basic building blocks are from classical Japanese. And one final thing I'll say is that there are a lot of stock metaphors in Japanese poetry. One of the most common is sore nureru, which means that my sleeves are wet. And what sleeves are wet, they may be talking about the spray at the beach at Naniwa, but what they're really talking about is I'm crying my eyes out because I'm being deprived of your love. And so when you see that, you're able to trigger off of those. Another one in the Buddhist poetry is, it has different expressions, yo no nakani or mono to omo, this thinking about the state of this world. You know that this poem is going to be focusing on that typically Buddhist notion that this life is like not something to be clung to. It's something to be sort of detached from a bit. And so you get those clues and you put that together with the ambiguity and you have a certain leeway. And of course, my task is much easier if I'm way out there on the spectrum of making the poem readable rather than trying to get tenure as a professor with something that's a poem. I should say I'm a recovering academic in the computer science department, so I know what that world's like.
I mean, not computer science, but you and me both. And it is, one of the things I always struggled with in my own brief forays into translation. There is this kind of desire, I think, when you start out with translation to just accurately try and, I want to try to represent things as accurately as possible. But when you do that with any language, but I think especially Japanese, with how different it is from English, you get something that is so stilted and challenging to just kind of grapple with. And you really do have to, I think, as a translator, one of the many reasons I'd be terrible at it, have some awareness of the fact that you are this additional layer in the text between, Fujiwara no Teika, whoever the poet is, and the reader. You have to kind of be in there and be comfortable with the fact that you are between the reader and the meaning, and sort of embrace a role for yourself as you're trying to convey the idea, convey the emotion. Where I think there is this kind of original instinct to try and be in there as little as possible, but that's not how translation works. When you have 2 different languages, there will always be some recalibration. There's probably a more poetic word I could use there, but in the process of moving from one to the other, and being aware of that, embracing it is important.
I agree. If you're the translator of something like classical Japanese poetry, you are a link between Fujiwara no Teika or Kinotsuru Yuki or Lady Murasaki. You are a link that spans 700 or 800 years to the modern reader. You want something that would come across, and what you want to come across, almost just by definition, has to focus on something that relates to the universal human experience. And again, that's what you look for, is that universality of the poem. and maybe I'll talk about that when we, briefly when we get into the poems themselves. That universality of the poem is what you try to communicate. You too have probably had this emotion, dear reader, so you can appreciate the articulation of it, the way it's expressed.
And on that note, I think it's a great time to start looking at some poems. I think we'll have time for about 3 or so. And I know I have a personal request, one of my favorites. I'll go ahead and say it is my favorite in this text that I would love to end with. But before that, I think we have time for about two more. So we're going to pull out our copies. And Mike, which one would you like to start with as we talk people
Oh,
through?
why don't you give me the spoiler alert and tell me what the last one is so I can make
Uh,
sure that I lead up to
I
it.
want to end on 62.
Okay. It's
Longtime
my,
listeners know I've say
that's what I thought.
Shonagon's my all-time
Yeah.
favorite.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start with Kino Tsurayuki, who is one of the, even in Lady Murasaki's day, he was one of the oldies but goodies. So this guy is quite far back there. And it's one of those poems where there's a rhythm to it that you can appreciate if you read the Japanese. So if you don't mind, I'll read the Japanese. And then, and this is a poem of nostalgia, a poem of even though Kino Tsurayuki was a bit of a courtier, he captures very well that sense of the passage of time and the ravages of time, in one's life. So here's the Japanese. Ito wa iza, kokoro mo shirazu, furusato wa hanazo mukashi no ka ni nioi keru. And here's the translation. People's ways and human hearts I'll never understand. Only the plum trees in my father's garden remain faithful in their fragrance. In other words, my friends have, gone elsewhere. Things have moved on. I'm a bit of a dinosaur, which is something I feel like daily. But the fragrance of the plum trees, that constant, that universal experience that I can go back to, refreshes my faith in life, in the cosmos, etc. So I find that a very touching poem.
It's a really beautiful one. I mean, I think for a couple reasons I really like this choice. First, I think you're right. It is a very universal human emotion. I mean, for me, the constant is probably my cats. I'm disappointed in humanity sometimes. I go out into the world and my students turn in crappy papers or something that has, clearly been written by Chat GPT. And the drivers on I-5 are cutting me off all the time, but I come home and my cats jump onto my lap and it feel, much like the fragrance of the plum trees, I'm reminded that there are things in the world that are worth it. Structurally also, I think this is a really interesting poem because if you know have looked at poetry, or if you've done like a haiku unit in high school English or something like that, you were probably told the structure is the syllable count 575, and then for tanka it's 575 and then the separate 7 7 kind of couplet at the end. And this one is interesting in the Japanese, and you capture it really well here. It's kind of flipped in the structure. The first two lines are kind of a distinct couplet, and then there's the kind of final three that talk about the plum tree. It's a good reminder, I think, that we can get kind of precious, I think, about Japanese poetry, and like when you're writing a haiku, it must, the important thing is matching the syllable count. Basho wrote a bunch of haiku that were not in 575. Kino Tsurayuki here is not following the kind of 57577 pattern in the traditional way. What matters is the emotion, the feeling, right? It's about the kind of the power of that. And you learn the rules so you can break the rules to be kind of interesting and stand out in this fun way. I really love that you capture that here. And of course, Keith Tsurayuki, pretty famous for a reason, I would say. And you can see it
Yes.
in this poem very
Yeah.
clearly.
No, I just one of my 3 or 4 favorite. Well, obviously the poems I've selected are my favorites, so it goes without saying that he's one of the favorites of this poetry. And I think you're absolutely right about him and about the structure. The particular bugaboo I have is the people who go in the West. They don't do this in Japan. Who get all wrapped around the axle about the difference between a haiku and a senryu. Senryu is got the exact same form as a haiku, but it's about human emotions rather than frogs jumping into ponds. The there's no distinction that I've seen. In Japan, it only seems to matter to the professors. The ordinary people think of it all as haiku because there's a whole gradient from a solitary nature experience to something that's got a little bit of the observer in it to something like this very personalistic, waka poetry. So yeah, you can very much get caught up in that. Now, the second poem I'm going to read, I'm going to point out something interesting because you've talked about illusions,
Mm.
and this poem actually has an allusion back to Kino Tsurayuki's poem, although the subject matter is very different. The second line of Kino Tsurayuki's poem, Kokoro mo shirazu, I do not understand the heart. Now, this poem by Lady Horikawa, the second line of her poem is Kokoro mo shirazu. Same
Mm.
line, in the same position. I do not understand the heart. But look what she does with it, what under heart she's trying to understand. So here's the poem. I'll just read it in English. And again, I want to emphasize, you can feel the universality of this emotion and admire the precision of the articulation of the image that she presents.
Mm.
Brooding over his intentions. Eternal? Did he really mean it? Thoughts and feelings in total disarray, like my long black hair strewn across the pillow that morning he departed.
Oh, that is a
Simple,
great
very
yeah.
precise image of the confusion, the almost the desolation of the parting. This is kind of really and the women of the Heian period will very often write these poems as saying, "Do you really mean it?" Or, "No, of course you don't mean it. Get out of my face," And Sei Shonagon's poem, which we'll get to in a second. But you'll notice that allusion, even in this poem that talks about something different, Kokoro mo shirazu, I don't know his heart, with same emotion that Tsurayuki is expressing. You don't have to be a PhD to capture some of these illusions, because
Absolutely, yeah.
some of them are just human experience.
I mean, I
Okay.
do, not to dunk on English
Yeah.
PhDs too much here. Many of them are wonderful people. I happen to be good friends with a couple. Um, I do think when you kind of take poetry, especially, and take this very academic read on it, where you're very worried about kind of classifying what is the genre and how does it fit into this wider evolution. I have never been a poet. It's not an art form that's ever really kind of I have ever felt the ability to kind of produce something there. But my understanding is like a lot of other poetry, the way you think of it is more in terms of who are specific, not like what's a genre that inspires me, but who's another person that inspires me or whose
Very
ideas I
definitely. Yeah.
connect with.
Right.
Absolutely. And you see that I think here with Lady Horikawa, who is kind of adapting, one assumes, having read the Keynote Tsuruyuki poem and feeling that kind of same emotion, and then thinking about, okay, how do I adapt that image to my context in this very kind of individual, almost like a master student relationship across time, right? Speaking back into the past by kind of
Sure.
grabbing onto this line.
Right.
I think, yeah, it's a great reminder of what how the process of making art is different from the process of analyzing art in this more kind of detached way.
No, I think that's an excellent point. If I thinking about my own background as I'm listening to you, even in the English poetry world, probably the poet I admire the most is Emily Dickinson. And she had this very aphoristic style that you might think of as, kind of like a Western equivalent of a waka or a tanka. You wouldn't call it a haiku, but her famous lines like, what's one I liked a lot? Forgive, O Lord, my little jokes on thee, and I'll forgive thy great big joke on me. Those sort of things, just getting it down so precisely to a wide range of emotions packed into a single line.
I mean, I should thinking of Dickinson very recently. I can't remember what context I saw some lines by her. Maybe it was the last time I was in New York. We were going to a museum, and I think every American who's been through high school and high school English in this country, I had to read some Dickinson in high school, and I recall not liking it very much because it was this very kind of analytical approach of let's all sit down and what's the metaphor, identify the literary device, write an essay on the literary devices of Emily Dickinson. And coming back to it, I just had room to appreciate the fact that she's funny. Like
Yes.
she can turn a good phrase in a way that elicits. You probably just heard me giggling a little bit just then. And you know, it's maybe I'm not appreciating all of the literary devices in that moment. But I'm appreciating the humor of this person who lived, oh man, reaching back into high school English two-ish centuries before today. I think that's
Yeah,
right.
I'd say roughly it's about right. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
have the my fingertip either. But
Hey,
that sounds
between
right.
the two of us, we're in the ballpark.
Early 19th century, yes. Mid 19th century, maybe.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's the I actually got a wonderful listener email a couple of weeks ago as I was putting these notes together, and about trying to appreciate poetry more and whether I had any advice for it. And I think that's my advice for appreciating poetry is just enjoy the feeling. Um,
Sure.
all right. I think actually probably have time for two more. So if you've got one more to pick, you'd like to pick out, and
Well,
then we can close with My Girl Say Shonagon.
sure. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to do say Shotogan first because
Oh,
I want to
please.
tell the story around this poem. Because we've talked this poem really well illustrates the richness that comes from understanding the context, even if you cannot pack the context into the poem itself. And if we still have time, I can grab another one. But there's this poem begins with an ancient Chinese legend about a Chinese nobleman. I think he was a duke of some sort or a prince. He was being held captive under house arrest in this town, and they weren't letting him out. And one of his retainers got this brilliant idea, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, he did a rooster's crow. And the guardsmen, thinking it was daylight was coming, opened up the gates, and this prince and all of his retainers just flew out of the gates before the gatekeepers could realize what had happened. Well, so you fast forward to the Heian period, and Lady Shonagon is entertaining a male visitor for the evening, and he leaves a little too early in the morning, which did not sit well with Shonagon. And so he wrote her his morning after poem to her was something of the fact that, must have made a mistake. Sorry, must have been that rooster's crow of that old Chinese legend. Okay. Now,
And then
Sei Shanagon is the bad girl of Heian period poetry. I mean, she is, just as I liked Mishima as a bad boy, I love Shanagon as a bad girl. And so she enjoyed shutting her lovers down, I think, every bit as much as she enjoyed entertaining him. So watch what she does with this guy who's just made this very lame excuse about, having heard the roosters crow a little too early. Deep in the night, pretense of a rooster's crow might fool an enemy or even just a friend. But do not dare to think mere imitation of a cock will open up a gate that's tightly shut. Which is just go away and don't bother me anymore. Now, to continue, I want to continue a little bit because I'm going to. Now, in those days, this was, the nobleman who received this poem didn't sort of burst into tears or shrink away in humiliation. He fired back. And this poem is not my own. It's a translation from one of the other translators. I think it's Mostow. So his name was Yukinari, and here's what he wrote in response. The gate that's tightly shut in her poem is a reference to a place called the Osaka Barrier, which is a checkpoint coming in and out of Kyoto. She said, "You'll
right.
never get past the Osaka Barrier." Everybody knew what she was talking about, but Japanese politeness demands that you sort of make it a bit indirect, talking about the Osaka Barrier.
Normally, this
So
would be like the meeting place you're welcoming. So, like, I guess meeting someone at the airport, maybe rough
right,
equivalent
exactly.
today.
And in fact, maybe that's the next poem I'll do if we have one time for it. But here's what Yukinari says back to Shonagon. He gives it right back to her. I've heard it said the Osaka Barrier can be freely crossed. No need here for a cock to crow. The gate is ever opened wide, awaiting each wanderer who comes to call.
Ooh,
So
that's
this is a cage fight. The
I
literary
mean,
cage fight.
and it really is remarkable to think about, this is not just two people kind of sniping back and forth at each other about, well, you're going to leave early, you're not welcome back in my bed. Well, I hear everyone's welcome back in your bed. This is
Exactly.
kind of public. The reason we have records of this is because they make these things public. They leave these poems around. And I always loved the artifice of the Pillow Book, the great kind of literary work Sei Shonagon is known for, where she claims that she didn't want it published and it was just discovered by accident that someone had found her, her writing that she left around, and she said, oh well, I guess it's out there now. Like, sure, that's what
Yeah.
happened.
Right.
And in the same way, you have this kind of ostensibly private correspondence, but it's also a chance to then show off, oh, look how clever I am in my private correspondence.
Right.
This both this very public and very private act in this way that I don't know has really an equivalent today. Maybe, I don't know, someone delivering a particularly devastating comeback in their text messages and then screenshotting it and putting it up on Instagram or something.
Yeah, I don't think it happens in the literary world quite as much, but the government's appropriated that technique in the way they leak things. Oh, sorry, you weren't supposed to see that.
Oh yeah, I mean that is a I guess a long-standing tradition in that way. Um
Exactly.
oh, that's a great poem. And
So do we have
again,
time for one more?
I think we have to I think we have time for one more.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna jump off from that Osaka barrier. And this is a poem that, just like, there's a line that's in common with Sei Shonagon's poem, but this is a poem about the Osaka barrier itself. And again, I'll read the Japanese because it's so beautiful. Kore ya kono, yuku mo kaeru mo, wakarete wa, shiru mo shiranu mo, Osaka no seki. And here's the translation. This is the border for those who leave, for those who return, for those who separate, for those we know and those we don't know, the hill of meeting. So you can see how these images like the Osaka barrier or Kokoro mo shirazu persist from poem to poem in almost like a reincarnation in a different body, emotionally speaking. And those are the threads that you can rely on. You're part of the answer to your question about, well, how do you translate this poetry when classical Japanese is so difficult? You can rely on some of these threads to help you kind of like, thread the story together throughout the poems. And
Yeah, I
anyway,
think the image of the thread is a powerful one in terms of, one of the things I've said on the podcast before I love about history is this ability to reach back into the past and almost feel like you've come to know someone who lives in a very different time in a very different context. I remember,
sure.
speaking of Heian literature, the first time in college I really felt that was reading, I think it was Ed Seidensticker's translation of, it's the English is As I Crossed a Bridge of Dreams. The Japanese original, it's one of the Nikkis. I forget which one.
Um,
It's gonna occur to me as soon as we finish recording. I'll remember the name of this text. But it's this diary of this young girl who comes to Kyoto from the provinces and is very excited for how fun her life is going to be now. And then things don't quite work out the way she wants, and she kind of deals with the disappointment of it. And I remember it feeling really powerful as a 19 or 20-year-old who's kind of feeling this emotion of my life is opening up in front of me, but also like, oh crap, I gotta stick the landing on this.
yeah.
And it was just this very kind of powerful moment. And that's, I think, the magic of literature, of poetry, of history, is to look back and say, life is hard. We struggle with the challenges of it. And also, you're not the first one, and you're not alone in that. And there is a power, I think, in seeing, even in very different time and place, that the things we face, are others have dealt with them before, and maybe that doesn't make it go away, but it's nice to know that you're not alone in that struggle.
Oh, I agree completely. What we tend to bond over is shared human experience. And when you can bring that experience across 700 or 800 years and make it present to people in the in the contemporary world, it's quite delightful. I mean, I have the same experience. Wishing I had known some of these poets. Gone to a cherry viewing with Kino Tsuruyuki, or what I wouldn't give to share a glass of sake with Sei Shonagon. Those kind
Oh
of
man,
thoughts.
I can only imagine. Oh, the Sarashina Nikki, that's the Japanese. I got it before
Oh
we
yes.
finished.
Okay. Okay.
But on that note, I think that's a perfect note to end on. So first, Mike,
Right.
thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Oh no, thank you
Really
very much for
appreciate it.
having me. Yeah.
Uh, and if you are at all interested, dear listeners, Mike's translation in English is 100 Poems from Old Japan, a translation from Tidal Publishing. It will be out in mid-August, I
Right.
believe.
August 26th is the official publication date.
Okay, so if you are listening this on release day, it'll be about 10 days in the future. Time to build some hype. Get your pre-orders in so you're ready to go day of. But if you're a few weeks behind, then by the time you're listening to this, it should be out. I really can't say enough. I think it's a beautiful translation. One thing I can't obviously share because we are on a podcast, but it's worth noting, the poems are all accompanied by absolutely beautiful illustrations from Edo period woodcuts showing, the ways in which these were reproduced during the Edo period with visuals. I can't really do them justice here, but it's a beautifully bound edition, a wonderful translation. I recommend it super highly. I think it's a great entry into Japanese poetry if that's something you're interested in. So, Mike, thank you again for being on the show. And
Sure. And if
listeners,
you don't mind my mentioning
oh,
the
please.
if you're interested in hearing any or all of the poems in English or Japanese, Title has very generously provided free audio recordings of every one of the poems, and Isaac will send you the link.
Yes, they'll be in the show notes, I believe. So if you download or if you open up the episode in your podcatcher of choice, there'll be a link that says show notes here. That'll take you to my website, and that will have the link to all of the recordings. Which given that it's poetry, I think hearing it really is part of the power too. So make sure you take a look if that's something you want to do. All right, folks. Until next time, thank you very much for listening. And again, Mike, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.